We are, oh, there we go. Good morning. I was going to say, I'm not sure it was on, but I'm going to try. We've had some problems with this microphone where it's I think it's picking up, getting interference from a radio station or something, so we've been trying to, Ryan said he adjusted the frequency, so we're going to try it this morning. If it gets, if we have any issue with it, we'll go back. We can always go back to the other one, so. I knew Chris wasn't going to be here this morning, and I wasn't sure if anybody was down to teach his class, but I think, I guess they are, because several of those people went in there. I thought this may not be the best time for his class to be coming in here, because we're right in the middle of talking about the Persian Empire, and they may say, well, what have we walked into? But we are talking about the Intertestamental period. And we've been talking about Persia, and we spent a lot of time on this because Cyrus is such a pivotal figure in the history of God's people. He's not the only one, but boy, he plays a very, very critical role. You recall, God's people were punished for there were two big reasons why Judah goes into captivity. Really, same thing with the northern kingdom, but both kingdoms we could say. What were those two reasons? Idolatry, perhaps, was numero uno. And what was number two? They had failed to do something. They had failed to keep the Sabbath, right? I think I heard somebody say it. They had failed to keep, I see high fives over here, so they almost had it. I thought I heard somebody say it. Yeah, they had failed to keep the Sabbath like they were supposed to. And this is one of the things that at the Biblical History Center, I gave the tour Thursday afternoon, and in the Hall of Artifacts, there are a few pieces of idols. And they're pieces because you can't find an intact idol in the Palestinian area. Because after the captivity, when they came home, they destroyed them all. And God broke them from idolatry. And what you're also going to find, if you recall from our Matthew class on Wednesday nights, is they're constantly getting after Jesus for what? According to them, breaking the Sabbath. They never had issues with those two things again. In fact, sometimes Brother Cates would tell us when we were in preaching school, the pendulum swings, and it, boy, my life, since then, it's been 20 plus years since I've been out of preaching school. I can still hear Brother Cates saying that, and experience has taught me the truth of that statement, because we had some in our class that were very near radical in some of their beliefs and views and things, and one guy in particular was a good friend of mine. He was way over here on the right, I mean, almost in what we would sometimes call anti-ism or anti-institutionalism, as some people call it. But then the pendulum swung, and now he is like in left field. And I don't even know if he would call himself a member of the Church of Christ anymore. So sometimes that happens, but the pendulum will, quite often swing. But, that's what happened with them with the idolatry. They come back home and they destroy any vestige of idolatry. They also say we're going to keep the Sabbath, but they get so serious about Sabbath keeping that they make rules where God hasn't made rules, such as, we talked about it, the Wednesday night before the meeting, in Matthew 12, when his disciples go through and they just grab some grain and rub it in their hands and just, blow the chaff away, and they're eating some wheat grains. And they say, you're breaking the Sabbath. You're reaping on the Sabbath. Well, that certainly was not what they were doing, but you see how the pendulum swings sometimes. But Cyrus, he played such a critical role in the freeing of God's people. God called him by name over 100 years before he was even born. In the book of Isaiah, we looked at those passages the Sunday before our gospel meeting. And so what we're going to do today is we come to Cambyses. I don't know that we will refer to these maps a whole lot. I just wanted to pull them up so you can kind of see. But you see again, the extent of the empire. This was an extremely large empire. And that one's not a very good picture, but I will leave it on this one because they're here. On this one, you can see by the color. I know you may not be able to see that, but that greenish color, the first one up top, rectangular square, that's the Heartland of Persia or Persis. That was when Cyrus ascended the throne. So, it goes from this right here, this little area, and then, you got territories gained by Cyrus, which is this purplish color, and then you got this orangish color here, and the green, light green, lime green maybe would be also territory gained by Cyrus. And then down here is where Cambyses has his territory that he's going to gain, and then Xerxes up here. And so that's kind of where we're talking about today, the Cambyses. Cambyses and Darius won't have as much to say about them as Cyrus because they're just not as pivotal a role, but there is information from them to be gleaned from them that helps us to understand the intertestamental period and how it came to play within the fullness of time and how God was working, sometimes behind the scenes through his providence to make everything just right for the Messiah to come into the world. Just like Cyrus before him, Cambyses, he was sort of carried on that policy of Cyrus of being a more benevolent ruler. Now you're going to see that change with Darius. Darius is going to establish himself with more firmness, more of an iron hand, as we say. But based on Persian policy, Cyrus, before he marched away for the last time, he recognized or named Cambyses as co-regent. So they're kind of co-regents together, and he gave full authority to him. And then Cyrus heads east to go way out here to defend his eastern border. And of course, he never came home, and that was kind of where we left off talking about Cyrus. There was a second son of Cyrus, though, Bardiya, Bardiya. The Greeks know him as Smerdis. And it's interesting because later on there's going to be another one come along that claims it's a different person, history tells us, but he was claiming to be Bardiya. And the Greeks, of course, called Bardiya Smerdis. And this other one that comes along claiming to be him, if you've ever read much in history, especially from the Greek slant, the Greek aspect, or point of view, I guess is what I'm trying to say, he's called Pseudo-Smerdis. He was an imposter, in other words. But this second son was entrusted with the eastern provinces. So he's out here on the eastern frontier, and that's where Cyrus is going to defend his borders. But before he leaves, they had capitals in different places. Here's Ecbatana, there's Behistun. Behistun is going to come into play, by the way, when we talk about Darius in just a moment. Susa, capital, there's a capital there. Sometimes, they're in Babylon. Where is Babylon? I can't find it all of a sudden. Does anybody see it? Right side of the Fertile Crescent. Yeah, there you go, Babylonia. Don't do that to me, Bob. I had to think for a second. Fertile Crescent. But, so there's a capital in Babylon, capital in Ecbatana. There's different places that, Cyrus kind of started that. He wouldn't have just the capital. He would have multiple capitals. So Cyrus goes to defend the borders. He leaves Cambyses as co-regent, but you've got Bardiya, who has charge of the eastern provinces. But when news of Cyrus' death reaches the empire, disorder breaks out. This period, by the way, is kind of obscure, and that's one reason why we don't have as much to say about it. It doesn't come into play as much with the history of God's people, but also because there's not a whole lot to go on. It's kind of an obscure period as far as what you can find out in history. But the disorder that broke out seems to be because Bardiya challenged Cambyses' right to the throne. And that's kind of the long and short of that. Some reports have Cambyses murdering his brother, Bardiya, and then concealing his death. There's the Behistun inscription that we'll talk about in a moment from Darius that seems to support that idea. He killed his brother, and then that way he gets him out of the way and he can ascend to the throne. But we don't know that for sure. Later on, returning from Egypt, Cambyses, as I mentioned just a moment ago, he's going to learn about a revolt from someone, this is, on down the way a little bit, but he's going to learn about a revolt from someone who's calling himself Bardiya. And again, we'll get to that in just a moment. But with the succession issue settled, whatever happened, Bardiya ends up dead, and the succession issue thus is settled. And so after about 4 years, now Cambyses is free to begin his expedition, his long-planned expedition against Egypt. And so when you have the vision in Daniel chapter 7, and here's a bear, and he rises up on one side, and he's got 3 ribs in his mouth. Remember, the Medo-Persian Empire rose up on the Medes, but then the Persian side became far more prominent. In fact, history remembers it, as the map shows here, as the Persian Empire. Sometimes we call it the Medo-Persian Empire. It kind of rose up on the backs of the Medes, but then once it got more powerful, the Persians took over and it became the Persian Empire. The 3 ribs, you recall, were 3 nations. 2 of them were conquered by Cyrus. Anybody recall them? We know number 1, right? Surely. Babylon. That was kind of the big dog, right? Because they conquered Israel, and Lydia was the other one that Cyrus conquered. And what's number 3? That's going to be handled by Cambyses. It's Egypt, right? And so Egypt and Babylon really were perhaps the 2 big dogs to deal with. And that's one reason why it didn't happen in Cyrus' lifetime. It had to be put off because Cyrus was no dummy. He knew this is going to take planning. This is going to take, you got to do this right if you're going to conquer Egypt. And we know Egypt was pretty powerful because when Nebuchadnezzar is constantly threatening Judah, some of the kings, instead of relying upon God, they did what? They would send to Egypt. They'd sometimes take gold out of the very temple of God and send it and say, here's a present. Help us out. Send us some troops. And even that was even the case back as far as Assyrian dominance, because remember Sennacherib when he came against Judah? And he says to the people there, he's sending a message to Hezekiah, but it's kind of like when you maybe somebody's not here, and I may say, just before a big crowd, hey, go give a message to him, and let me tell you what I want you to tell him, and you say it out loud for everybody to hear because you want everybody to hear it, right? That's kind of what the Rabshakeh was doing from Sennacherib, from Assyria. And he says, go tell Hezekiah, who are you leaning on for support? Egypt? Are you leaning on Egypt for support? What's the analogy, the metaphor he uses of Egypt? He says they're a what? They're a bruised reed, a broken reed that if a man leans on, it's just going to pierce his hand. It's the idea of using a cane, and you've got a cane that has a knife point, and so you go to lean on it for support on your bum leg, and it just goes right through your hand, and it hurts you. It doesn't help, in other words. Well, Sennacherib wasn't leaning on Egypt. Sorry, Hezekiah. Hezekiah wasn't leaning on Egypt. He was leaning on Jehovah. And, of course, the angel of the Lord goes out and kills all those troops, and Hezekiah and Judah was delivered for that time. Unfortunately, they went back into apostasy and ended up falling sometime later. So, Cambyses is free to go against Egypt, and so he's going to do that. Egypt's era, by the way, at this point is long past. They were still a world power, make no mistake, but their era of greatness has long since been passed by the time of Cambyses. But, they do have strength still. And as Pfeiffer puts it in his book, the pharaohs had illusions of grandeur. In other words, they thought they were a lot stronger than they really were. Pharaoh Hophra, he's going to contest Nebuchadnezzar's claims in Palestine. Now, this is where it ties in with God's people, because Nebuchadnezzar is saying, I'm going to lay claim to Palestine. That's part of his conquest. That's, of course, the area of Israel, Jerusalem, all this. Nebuchadnezzar had laid claim to that, and Pharaoh says, oh, no, you don't. And Nebuchadnezzar says, yeah, I do. And so some of these kings of Judah would try to get help from Egypt, and it failed. And so what's going to happen is, even after the fall of Jerusalem, if you read the book of Jeremiah, they take Jeremiah against his will. He tells the people, stay here in the land. You take your lumps, is kind of what we would say. God says this is his decree. This captivity is from God, so stay here. serve under the Babylonian governor that he's put in place, and serve God faithfully. And what do? Here comes a guy, they get a group together, they murder the Babylonian governor. And they know, you've murdered the Babylonian governor, what's Nebuchadnezzar going to say about that? He ain't going to like it. He's coming for you. So they flee, and they take Jeremiah against his will, and they head into Egypt. And so Jeremiah is prophesying then the latter part of the book, and he's telling them, you think, God through him is saying, you think you're going to escape me going to Egypt? Guess what? Nebuchadnezzar's coming to Egypt too. And he did, and he inflicted some damage, but he did not just utterly conquer Egypt. But all that to say, their heyday was long past. And at the fall of Jerusalem, and shortly thereafter when Nebuchadnezzar did come against Egypt, that was kind of an all-time low for the Egyptian dynasty, or empire, if you will. So Egypt only was in alliance with the Greek world, and they did make an alliance with the Greeks, but one of the best Greek generals betrayed them. And again, you see the providence of God working. He's got everything working just right so that when the fullness of time comes, the Messiah is coming into the world. So one of the best Greek generals betrayed Egypt, and kind of to sum it up in the Reader's Digest version of it, basically he gave away the Egyptian defensive secrets, all the secrets of their defense. Not only that, Cambyses, he's marching toward Egypt, but he halts at, I was going to see if it's on our map, he halts his troops at Gaza or Gaza, depending on how you want to pronounce that. I don't think it's on the map. I thought it might be, but I'm not seeing it. If you see it, holler. Sidon and Jerusalem. Yeah, okay, so right in this area here, right? Yeah, it's just a little bit northwest of Jerusalem? Southwest, okay. So yeah, in this area here at least. So Cambyses, he's got his troops marching, but he halts here. And the reason is because he's headed down here. He's headed toward the capital at Memphis. But there's a problem. What's in between? A whole lot of nothing, a whole lot of desert. And you got troops. Troops need food, but more than that, they need water. What do? And if they're marching and you want to get there in any decent amount of time, you got to march at a decent clip. Well, they're going to be using more water. So what do? Well, part of this Greek generals, one of the greatest military leaders of the Greeks who betrayed the Egyptians, part of what he did was he put Cambyses in touch with this sheik of the Bedouin tribes, and this fella, they worked out a deal. And so what the sheik did was he set up camel water relays along the route. And so they would get to a point, and the troops could have water. And they'd march for a little bit further, and he'd have camels there waiting, and they'd have water, I guess some type of means of carrying water. And so that's how they got through the desert, and they made really good time. Well, that alone probably would have done in Egypt, but between that and betraying the secrets of their defenses, this leader of Egypt, Psammaticus III, he fled to Memphis. That's where the final showdown was going to happen. Cambyses sent messengers demanding the surrender of the capital. You know what he does to the messengers? Killed them. And you can imagine how that made Cambyses feel. So he attacked in strength. And surprisingly, the Egyptian resistance was pretty firm. I mean, you're fighting in your homeland, for your homeland. I guess that helps, but they did eventually fall to the Persians. The city did eventually fall. So, and again, it seems Cambyses continued Cyrus' policy. He becomes basically like a true successor to the pharaohs. He pays homage to the Egyptian gods, and he even claimed to be a son of the sun god. He claimed to be an S-O-N son of the S-U-N, sun god, Re. If you've ever studied anything with Egypt, you know one of the gods they worship, one of their idols, was the sun god, Re. He says, I'm a son of Re, and so I'm your rightful leader. And of course, they accepted that foolishly. But anyway, so he made reforms just like Cyrus in the people's interest. He entrusted a high Egyptian official with the country's administration. And so with Egypt firmly in his control, Cambyses wants to go over into the areas of Africa and continue the conquest. That's kind of another story for another time, I suppose. But I will tell you, there was an expedition of 50,000 men that he sent. And they were sent against the oasis of Ammon, is the name of it. It was an oasis out in the desert. But the troops were never heard from again. And to this day, historians are puzzled by it. Some people think that there was, I was trying to find it in my notes. I think there was, it just says Greek sources. I thought it might have been Herodotus. But Greek sources say that a sandstorm overwhelmed those troops. Nobody really knows to this day, but Cambyses did have some African conquests. They were not a 100% failure, but for the most part, he didn't really go much further than Egypt. And that's why when you see on this map just this little area, you can see out here toward Libya, he did do some more conquests, but it's pretty much Egypt. He's after a short stay in Memphis, he's going to head home. He hears about issues at home, and so he's going to go home to deal with those, and he's going to leave garrisons in Egypt, garrisons of troops. He's going to leave garrisons at Daphne, Memphis, and Elephantine. And I was seeing if, here we go, Elephantine. This is kind of the first cascade or waterfall of the Nile. You got them at Daphne's not listed on here. But anyways, the reason I mention that is because the garrison at Elephantine is important to us in our study because it was manned by Jewish mercenaries. Now, there were some Jewish men who had become like soldiers for hire, and they manned that garrison. And we'll at least mention them a little bit later on, but I want to mention that so you know. These men, these Jewish people, they had a temple of their own. They had correspondence with their contemporaries over in the Palestinian area. Now, how true they were to the law of Moses is another story. I mean, they got their own little temple there, right? But they were of Jewish origin. Cambyses decides to head home, and he receives confirmation that there's a usurper calling himself Bardia, his long-dead brother. And, of course, the Greeks began to refer to him as Pseudo-Smyrtus. Cambyses heads home, and by the way, the usurper also assumed this, his real name, history tells us, is Galmata. And that he was gaining traction. That was the problem. And he was gaining acceptance. Cambyses is going to go home to deal with him, but he never reaches home. And again, that's one of the mysteries of history. Nobody knows exactly what happened to Cambyses. Some people say he had an accidental self-inflicted wound that led to his death. Some people say he committed suicide, seeing that this rebellion was gaining traction. Some people say that, we do know he had some epilepsy. History tells us that. Some people say he had an epileptic episode and he died. Some people say he was dealing with some insanity and died. We just don't know. But after his death, the army maintained loyalty to him and to the government he represented. But within 2 months or so, Galmata was captured, he was executed, and so Darius, the son of Hystaspes, would become the next Persian monarch. And that's where we go from there, is talking about Darius. He had to establish his succession with great difficulty. Again, it took 2 months or so, but it was not an easy thing to do. But here's the big thing I want to remember about Darius. Unlike Cyrus, unlike Cambyses, he's going to adopt a policy of firmness. And it's going to stand out from those two other leaders before him. It's actually sometimes how Darius led was more reminiscent of the Assyrians. You remember we talked about their cruelty? He could be pretty cruel. But he's most famous for the Behistun, perhaps most famous for the Behistun inscription. Again, here's Behistun. This is pretty amazing. This is your first, this is your kind of billboard of ancient times. This is maybe where people got the idea for billboards. There was a road there, the main caravan route between Baghdad and modern-day Baghdad and Tehran, 65 miles from Hamadan. But there was a roadside spring there where ancient travelers pretty much had to stop, get some water, refill water. And so what he did was he carves on a mountainside. I mean, it's like 500 feet or so above sea level. And he carves on this mountainside 58 and a half feet long. And it's all about his conquests and all the great things he accomplished. You know, these humble leaders, they love to leave a memoir for the world to know exactly what they've done in their time to, all their impressive feats. Well, that's what Darius did. Instead of putting his on a cylinder or something like Cyrus did, or a stela, is I think how some of the Babylonians, instead of anything like that, he decides, I'm going to carve mine into a mountainside. But it is really, really impressive, and I think you can still actually visit that today. It's obviously not quite as detailed and the same as it was back then, but pretty impressive. First ever billboard advertising, I suppose. Darius and the Jews. You recall rebuilding the temple. This kind of brings it all back, how it ties in with our Bible history. The Jews were allowed to return under who let the Jews go home? Cyrus, right? First main ruler of Persian Empire. Not a whole lot going on with the time of Cambyses as far as that, but if you recall, when Cyrus lets them go home, who led that first return? This is kind of a pew packers question I used to ask all the kids. I'd ask them how many returns and who led each return. How many returns? 3. First one was led by, somebody said it. It was kind of the, I guess kind of both of them really. Zerubbabel kind of was placed more or less as a governor. Then the second return, who led it? Ezra. And the third? Nehemiah. And we'll get to those. But this first return, Cyrus lets the Jews, anybody that wants to, you can go home. And so they go home and they begin to do what? They start on building the temple or rebuilding the temple. But they stopped. Why did they stop? This is what we looked at 2 weeks ago. Some of the Jews' enemies troubled them, and they sent a letter to the king and said, if they rebuild this city, you just check the archives and see, they're going to rebel. And so somebody checks and sees and says, well, sure enough, boy, these kings have been powerful back in the day, and they kind of have a history of rebellion. So yes, cease and desist. So the Jews stopped, and that was it. And I mean, it just sat for years. And they work on their own homes, and so it had halted. Well, the last days of Cyrus and pretty much all of the reign of Cambyses, those were tough times for these exiled Jews, or these Jews returning from exile. They were harassed by unfriendly neighbors still. They were basically trying to take care of daily necessities. Now, you're going to find out later from some of the prophets, one of the reasons they were struggling just to get by day to day, living, what's the expression? Is it hand to mouth? Burning their candle at both ends. One of the reasons for that, one of the main reasons was they stopped. They stopped building the Lord's house. And God says, quit being so concerned with your own stuff ahead of God's, and you'll be blessed. But those were difficult times for them, and history bears that out. And we could, again, if we had more time, we'd talk about that a lot. But the people agreed for sure on one thing. And paraphrasing just a little bit from Haggai 1:2, the time has not come that the Lord's house should be built. That was about the only thing they were all 100% agreed upon. The time has not come that the Lord's house should be built. And God sends Haggai and Zechariah and says, get busy. You stop worrying about your stuff ahead of God's stuff, and then you'll be blessed. You got your priorities all wrong. And so God sends Haggai and Zechariah to really stir up the people and light a fire. And, of course, we learn that's exactly what they did. So Zechariah, Haggai, they come to stir up the people, and there's a Persian governor beyond the river, Tatnai. If you want to go to the book of Ezra. I'm going the wrong way. So this is in Darius' second year. And we've talked before, not everything in Ezra happens just, bang, bang, chronologically. Sometimes there's a big gap. So the King James has him as Tatnai. History records him as Tattenai, Tattenai. But this is in chapter 5 of Ezra. Now, chapter 4 closes with, "Then ceased the work of the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. So it ceased unto the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia." So, that's where you've got this gap of several years. Now, the second year of Darius, they start rebuilding because Haggai and Zechariah come and say, "Get busy." And so they say, "Okay, let's get busy." Well, then Tatnai comes along, and he has a question. He's probably spurred on by some of the Jews' enemies. The same thing that happened the first time, right? Some of the Jewish enemies probably said, "Hey, it's kind of like when your kids want to tattle on each other. Look, I don't know if I should say anything, but those Jews, they were told to stop, but they're working on that temple again. And I mean, I'm looking out for the king's best interest. So you do whatever you think's right. That's probably what happens. They're probably instigating this. So Tatnai comes to investigate, and he asks a very pointed question. What is it in verse 3? Yeah, it's kind of like when we talk about, Matthew 21, and the Jews ask Jesus, by what authority do you do these things? Who gave you this authority? Jesus doesn't say, "I don't need authority." So, authority is all throughout life. Tatnai wants to know, okay, I see you're building here. Who commanded you to resume this project that was halted? Who said this is okay? Who gave you permission to build this temple, to build up this wall? So he wants to know, where's your authority? And so the Jews, interestingly, they appeal to the decree of Cyrus. And they say, look, go search through the archives and you'll find it. You'll find out what Cyrus said. Where is it? Verse 7 and following. It kind of goes for several verses there. But they essentially say, Cyrus said we could. Go search. You'll confirm it. So Darius did. He searched. He found the decree. And he ordered them to then honor the decree. This is getting into chapter 6. So he made a decree. Search was made in the house of the scrolls, we would say, where the treasures were laid up in Babylon. So they found it. And when you get to verse 7, "Let the work of this house of God alone. Let the governor of the Jews and the elders of the Jews build this house of God in his place." And he even goes on and says, "I'm going to make a decree that if they need money, if they need supplies, we're going to provide that." So this, was in the second year of Darius, and so he orders the work continues, give them funds from the royal treasury if they need it, and supplies if they need it. And so there was other opposition, of course, but in spite of all this opposition, the Jews continued. They finished the work in the 6th year of Darius. This was 516 BC. In fact, you'll see if you've got your intertestamental period chronology in front of you, 515 BC is the date they have there. Of course, a lot of these dates are approximate 515, 516, somewhere in that vicinity. The restoration or rebuild of the Jews' temple in Jerusalem was completed. And this is about 516 BC. You see that in Ezra 6, 15 through 18. The house was finished, 3rd day of the month Adar, 6th year of the reign of Darius. So you got the Israelites, priests, Levites, rest of the children of captivity kept the dedication of this house of God with joy. And they offered at the dedication 100 bullocks, 200 rams, 400 lambs, and for a sin offering for all Israel, 12 he-goats according to the number of the tribes of Israel. They set priests in their division, Levites in their courses, for the service of God which is at Jerusalem, as it is written in the book of Moses. Well, another thing that we remember under Darius is under his reign, the king was supreme. But there were still some limitations, right? In fact, the king was bound by his own word, his own decrees. And you see this in the book of Daniel in particularly, also even getting into the book of Esther, because there's a statement that is made several times. According to the law of the Medes and the Persians, which altereth not. In other words, not even the king could change that when he sought to rescue Daniel. And they reminded him of that several times. Oh, you can't change this, king. He was kind of duped into signing this decree that no one could pray to any other person except the king for 30 days. Well, that's going to come into play later on in the New Testament age, because you have this idea that when there's true law and order, even the king himself must abide by his own decrees. And so it provides stability, law, and order when the gospel comes, and of course it's going to help the spread of the gospel. Darius' civil reorganization, by the way, remember Cyrus, if Cyrus, and Cambyses, same thing, if he conquered Egypt, who did he put in charge? An Egyptian. If he conquers Babylon, he puts a Babylonian in charge. Darius doesn't do that. And so I don't know if you've ever thought about this. Until I had done this study, I don't know that I gave it a whole lot of thought. But do you remember who led the first return from captivity? Who did we say? Zerubbabel. Have you ever noticed Zerubbabel just disappears? He's just gone. There's no indication of what happened to him. Why is he not the governor anymore? He was kind of appointed, like a governor. Well, that would be typical Cyrus policy. I need a governor over there in the Palestinian area. Well, those were Jewish people, so yeah, get a Jew to be the governor. Zerubbabel. Then he's just gone. Well, Darius has this civil reorganization, and he decides, I don't know that that's the best policy. I'm going to make one of my people governor. Some historians have even tried to say, in fact, even some Bible historians have tried to say that Zerubbabel rebelled. There was some kind of insurrection. There is no indication whatsoever from Scripture or secular history that he had any kind of insurrection or had any kind of impropriety that would cause him to be removed. What definitely makes the most sense is probably that he was removed from this reorganization that Darius did. And then finally, from Darius, one other thing I want to mention before we run out of time, his postal system was impressive, to say the least. I mean, it surpassed all before it, and many even since. There was a network of roads in the Persian Empire that were divided into postal routes, and they had horsemen stationed at regular intervals along the route. So messages from the king to a satrap or a satrap to the king were relayed along this route. There were 111 stations that were located along this 1,677-mile road, particularly from Susa to Sardis and Ephesus. If you were in a caravan traveling that road and you wanted to go from start to finish, it would take you 90 days. It's a 3-month trip, basically. If the king needed to send a message to a satrap, and king's over here at point A, and he needs to go all the way to the other end of that road to point B, you want to take a guess how long it took? 1 week. That's unreal. That is impressive. That was their postal system. In fact, it was so impressive, Herodotus gave a description of them. And if you're ever in New York, you can read it. It's engraved above the New York post office. These neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor darkness of night prevent from accomplishing each one his appointed task with the very utmost speed. That's kind of the modern slogan for our United States Postal Service. That was something that Darius had kind of to his name. The Behistun inscription, the Postal Service, the reorganization of civil government, which again probably explains why Zerubbabel just sort of disappears, but also the rebuilding of the Jewish temple was finished in his 6th year, because the Jews, spurred on by Zechariah and Haggai, they began to rebuild. And someone said, "Who gave you permission to do this?" And they said, "Cyrus did. Go check and see." He did. And so they finished it. Darius is going to clash with Greece, and Greece is going to kind of undermine Darius. They're going to sort of encourage some rebellion and some insurrection within his empire, and it's going to really weaken the power of the Persian Empire. And so what you start to see after Darius, Cyrus, Cambyses, maybe Darius, they're sort of at the pinnacle, and you're going to start to see this weakening of the Persian Empire, and pretty soon, as Persia is kind of like this, Greece is over here, and they're rising. And pretty soon Greece is going to find a young genius at the helm named Alexander, and they're going to sweep the world and conquer, and the Persian Empire will be no more. So we'll talk next week, Lord willing, about Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and may have time next week to get into talking about Alexander and how all this. Alexander's called the Apostle of Hellenism. One of his greatest contributions was the spread of Hellenism, and particularly Koine Greek, which will become the language of the New Testament. And it's such a great, great contribution to the fullness of time when God's going to bring in the Messiah, his only begotten Son. We'll take up, Lord willing, next week. For now, we'll have a short break before worship begins. Thank you. Covered all my notes. I don't believe it.